Testing audio. Hopefully you can hear me. Victoria, can you confirm that you can hear me? Are you guys ready to start soon? Or does anybody want to move closer, or are we all feeling okay? Let me know in the back if you want me to zoom in more, if I'm making the mistake of not zooming in enough, okay? For those in the back. Very quiet. Okay, so let's move that up. Hopefully this is better. I'm going to speak a little bit louder. I'm doing a 5x5. Nice. Thank you, Gabe. You fixed it. Okay, awesome. Great. Oh no, forgot my water. Okay, whatever. Week 1, day 4. Is it already Thursday? Oh my gosh. Is it just me, or did this week just fly by? Yeah? It's crazy, like you're here so many hours of the day. I'm assuming people are here at least till like 7, 8, 9. How many people here have been generally here till like 9, with the skeleton crew teachers? Wow, quite a few of you. Not surprised by that, especially in the last few days. How many people here are feeling a little bit behind / overwhelmed? Just curious about the count. About half of you over here. I'm curious about Victoria. We did warn you, I guess. This is, it goes a little bit fast. What I'll say about that is it's very easy to kind of look at this and go, oh my gosh, like I'm not getting the learning outcomes for that day fully. Yesterday was about objects. I don't feel comfortable with objects. How are we moving on from this? Yeah, it takes time. So many times I hear even alumni saying, oh yeah, like I didn't really fully get React. We do React later in the course, until I did my own app or a couple other projects after bootcamp. It takes a few attempts before you really feel comfortable with that material, right, with that particular thing that you're learning. What we try to do as best as possible is do just-in-time learning. What that means is only teaching you what you kind of need in the moment versus trying to go deep into something that may give you a little bit of context, maybe give you a little bit of kind of deeper insight, but will take too much time and is something that's okay to learn later. Last time I was here, I was talking about university degree in computer science and how 80% of it wasn't really used by me after I graduated. That's not to say that it was useless. It's just that it could have come afterward, through my career potentially, if that was my goal, which it was. So I guess what I'm trying to say is we are introducing objects yesterday, but that doesn't mean that we're moving on from objects, right? The idea is that everything builds on each other, and you're learning just enough to have some fundamentals so that when you're going the next day, you're, able to kind of build a little bit on top of that. Now, in some cases, you might still be finishing an activity or two from yesterday. From what I saw, I think it's the last 1 or 2 assignments from yesterday, the music library. Then some people are still wrapping up. It's okay if you start off the day wrapping that up. Obviously, time box that a little bit. Keep that in mind when you're pair programming, how you want to kind of figure that out. If it's confusing, if your pair is somebody who's already started or even further along today and you're still finishing up music library, that might be a conversation to have with Davey, just to figure that out, right? But generally, the stuff that we're going to keep covering is going to keep touching in lecture and in assignments on the topics that have been covered previously. Right? We're still in fundamentals week. How many people here are feeling comfortable when they see, the debugging exercise that we had? I think it was in day 2. Is that, Tuesday, right? The debugging day. There's this massive piece of code, right, that you're expected to debug. That must have been a little bit, yeah, that must have been a little bit, if that doesn't trigger imposter syndrome, I don't know what will in the first week. I wanted to spend a little bit of time on reading code using this example. I know this is something that we talked about on the very first day or second day when I had my lecture with you. And then I think Nima covered a little bit in his exercise in the breakout that day. How was that lecture with Nima, by the way? Pretty cool, eh? So I want to kind of make sure that we're feeling comfortable with how to look at existing code. As I mentioned in my lecture previously, it's a completely different skill, even for somebody who's a seasoned developer, to like, especially if it's on like some other screen, not yours, and you don't have control over that screen, to be able to read that code. Why is that an important skill? Looking at code that's not even on your screen and being able to read it and understand as quickly as possible what that code is doing. Yep. You're more than likely not going to be writing just code on your own screen in a job situation. Right. But you'd still be, I mean, when we see like, when we picture developers working in a company, they're mostly staring at their own computers, and they're usually working on code on their computers. So maybe they're pair programming is your point, but even then they're working. Ah, I see. Yes, you're adopting code all the time, right? It's very rare, actually, especially as a junior developer, to be given green field, go build something, here's our vision. That's not a good company decision, right? Sometimes our students or alumni have fallen into that. Why are we laughing about that? Did I miss? Yeah, that would be tough, right? Because you're making a bunch of higher level architectural decisions that you should ideally have some mentorship doing, right? But you'd be surprised. There's some alumni that get positions at startups where I've heard this story before. Like, oh yeah, I got a job. There's a couple of senior devs there. They quit. And so now I've been given like the responsibility of just seeing this through at least for a few months while they figure out the senior situation. These things happen. Hopefully you'll feel more comfortable than you do now, 10, 12, 15 weeks from now with regards to at least bridging that gap. But nonetheless, you're going to be adopting code a little bit. And while hopefully you won't be responsible for like designing the whole software right from your first job, be an interesting challenge, you'll still be given existing code that you have to adopt and like fix bugs in or enhance. So the quicker you are, the faster you are at reading that code, the better, right? There's another reason though. Specifically, my question around looking at code that actually you're not going to actually modify, but it's just up on a screen, a la lecture. Can you imagine a situation in your job where that might happen? Yeah. Oh, Victoria. There's quite a bit of audio feedback again. Okay. So just put it down, sort of thing? That's new. Gabe, let me know if that fixes things, but there's going to be a delay before you see an update. Testing, testing. Is there any audio feedback, Gabe? I see. So I'll try to move around less, and then we'll get this looked at. Maybe this thing needs to be replaced.
Is there by any chance any air blowing down on you?
No, I don't feel anything. But good debugging skills right there, right? Thinking outside the box. Hopefully this is good. I'll just wait a few seconds for them to confirm. Gabe or Nicholas, how is it sounding? Much better? Okay, or hopefully better. Yeah, so I wanted to ask, where else in your job are you going to see some code up on a screen and have to, as rapidly as possible, understand what it's doing, aside from lecture over here? Yeah.
I've never worked in the field, but I can imagine if there's a team working on a project, they might have the code up and say, okay, this is what we're working on today. We're trying to, I don't know, give me a
the team essentially putting the code up on a screen and discussing it
Yeah.
in some way or form, whether it's to divvy it out or actually more likely to review it.
Okay, yeah.
So group code reviews are a thing that are used quite commonly in different ways. Sometimes people are just sitting around a table with their own laptops and have the code up on their screen so that they're more comfortable being able to navigate it. Many would argue that that's a better approach to code reviewing, even if you're doing it as a collective. Although I've definitely seen in the companies that I've worked at, bringing it up on the screen and reviewing it together. And the person who's actually written the code is like up in front, navigating and showing and talking to the code. So there's another skill involved that comes with time, which is to be able to present what you've built, the feature that you built with existing code, to be able to present it in a way that's easy for existing devs that are sitting and have no control to be able to view it. Sorry, you were saying? You were going to say? Clive? In an interview is another example. Absolutely. It could be an interview that's done remotely over Skype or something of that nature, where they're showing you some code and asking you what it does, and you may or may not have control over that screen. And even if you do, even if it is on your computer, you may or may not be able to edit it. That may not be the exercise, right? It's just tell me what this code does, right? You'll see some of that in our mock tech interviews that will start next week as well. So that's something I want to spend a little bit of time on before we get into functions and callbacks. How would I go about reading this code? Where do your eyes land? How do you start? What things do you use to your advantage? Name of the function was thrown out, so that's your human intuition. You're hoping. You can't trust. Yeah, you can't trust it fully, but hopefully it's named in a way and that's why naming is important. We talked about that in day 2. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of an indication. So yes, definitely use that to your advantage. Top down, so you would kind of start reading in what way? Like line 1, 2, 3, 4 sort of thing?
Just work your way through the code and seeing what you're seeing.
Yeah, definitely scanning the code gives you a little bit of, you kind of need to do that, right? There's only kind of, it is top down in a way, right? It's written in that way, in a way. So you're going to have to do that. But I would argue that going top down for too much of this code is actually what I want to try and avoid having you do. So there's a little bit of that, but you don't want to do too much of it. Who's helping me with Victoria questions or answers? Shmuel, are you helping?
Yeah.
Perfect.
Informally, speed it down.
Oh, what the heck?
Video is cutting in and out.
Today is not a great day.
Sorry, Victoria.
Is Mikey their internet?
Is it your internet or ours?
That's me.
I know it's
Computer on fire.
exactly.
Well, when I refreshed the YouTube page when I was setting it up, it was down, and I just figured it was like a momentary thing. So it might be YouTube. Wi-Fi here is up. Okay, do a. Sorry, folks, give me a second. Okay, so hopefully we're back. Google's to blame. We left off talking about reading it top down, but not getting down that rabbit hole too much. Why would I say that? The computer isn't necessarily executing or reading the JavaScript top down. So basically, we're talking about control flow. In terms of how the code executes, it's not necessarily top down, right? Of course, if the function we're talking about in the code review in question is the function on line 1, and we already see it having executed in some context, then we can just focus on that function, right? But in just first glance, I'm looking at some code that I've never seen before, and I need to refresh my memory or for the first time understand how this is actually running in this entire file or maybe multiple files, I probably want to actually try and be empathetic to the computer and really see the control flow. So what would that mean? Right? It's what Nima kind of showed you a little bit with Python Tutor, right?
Yeah.
So you have the function declared here. And then what's nice is that we indent code, even though the computer doesn't care. The runtime generally doesn't care about indentation. Most languages don't care, unless you're Python or some other languages of that nature that do care about indentation, and that's part of the code structure. But in most languages, the white space, specifically the indentation, is of no consequence. This entire file could be in one line of code. Minified JavaScript is a term in the community, where it's just completely minimized into one line of code. Is fine for the computer. It doesn't care about the indentation. As long as the semicolons and all of those are in place, it knows where the lines are and where they end, right? So it's really about the indentation for us, exactly. And so this is why it's also important to indent stuff as you go. I don't know if how many people here have had mentors come, try to help them with something, and at least I do this. If the indentation is off, I'll say first fix the indentation before we even talk about the issue at hand. Has that happened with anybody yet? Yeah, a little bit. I see some heads nod. If not, it may not happen to you, but it's for a reason. We need to be able to understand how the code is actually going to execute from a control flow standpoint. In order to do that, I need to see the indentation right off the bat. I'm not specifically reading words. My eyes are actually, and this takes some time to get used to, my eyes are actually just looking at the left-hand column and how it's indenting, that staircase that's kind of forming in my head. Right? That takes time to kind of develop as a skill, as a habit, but just something to be aware of. So really, my eyes are going to land here. And then, assuming I don't care too much about this function yet, I'm going to say everything indented in here, I don't care about until it's executed. Then I see the leftmost thing is multiple. One line takes these arguments. OK, I'll remember that there's a function here. If ever I need to go look it up, I can go look it up on line 42 or around there. And then really I start looking at, again, outermost indentation until I get into a function call, at which point I'm going to jump into that function call. Right? Now in here, when I'm looking at this function, am I going to go line by line and read each of these variables? That's what JavaScript is doing, right? JavaScript is, in control flow, executing this line by line. So it's not that you have to be dogmatic, like exactly the runtime, because you have certain advantages, right? You have intuition. And you're not responsible for perfect execution of the code either, like JavaScript is, right? And so what you can do is say, OK, there's a bunch of variables here, and they all seem to be like, this one seems like it's calling a function. OK, so maybe I care about this, but maybe I only care about this when it's being used, right? Oh, it's being used here. Maybe I only care about this when this is being used, right? I can see kind of build this dependency in my head of this is dependent on that, is dependent on that, is dependent on that. But all of this seems like setup work. So I'm not going to read it too heavily. I'm not going to exactly know what that's doing. I'll get to it when the time is right. Even though in JavaScript, that would execute, right, fully. And we would actually go into that function and see what that function is doing. So that's where you're going to use a little bit of that judgment to decide how far to go with that control flow logic. Yeah.
You might check to see like where, so spec days, you know it's being called there in that array, but maybe check anywhere else in the file to see like, is spec days.
Yeah, absolutely. I do that so much. Check elsewhere in the file where it's being called. Yeah. Just quick, like it doesn't take a lot of effort because all I do is select. Yeah, exactly. Select, and sometimes you want to just see where else in the project it's being called. Yeah. Because for now you're used to the file, right? But my habit is Command C, Command Shift F, yeah. Command Paste, yeah. Enter, and I want to see where else it's being called. And in this case, it's just this one file, right? And then I can even double click and end up at that location, right? And yeah, I'm in Sublime Text. I don't think I have any special extensions for what I just did.
When I do search, it doesn't compile it all like that in one single. Like it comes. It's like more like Word when it like goes down.
Odd. We could talk about that later. I'm not sure why that is. Yeah, different. You can maybe look into why that UI is different. I'm not sure. I thought this was built into Sublime. Maybe I installed something a long time ago that does it this way, but I'm pretty sure not. I don't know. Does this resonate with everybody in terms of how to be reading this code? Right now, you're dealing with 1 or 2 levels of nesting. It's not necessarily a deal breaker if you don't do this. But if you want to start building that habit now, it's going to be really useful when you have many different files with different modules, and logically you're 3, 4 nested levels deep. Right? So you have to think about scope and all those things when you're in that process. And so going through this approach is a little bit better. Okay. Any questions about that before I move on? So we're going to talk about callbacks today. And I'm going to introduce callbacks in a kind of logical progression. When I'm introducing concepts like this, I prefer to try and, to the best of my ability, not just be like, here's a cool solution. Let's talk about the solution and the problems that it can solve. I try to, as best as possible, although it's tough with callbacks, or tough in general, come up with problems and then introduce solutions to them. Okay? So our kind of logical progression here, the first thing I really want to talk about is the fact that we have 2 main things in software, right? What are the 2 main things in software that we have that I talked about in my second lecture? Software is really a collection of data and, what to do. Software is data and behavior, right? Actions, functions, if you will. So data is your var x equals 5. Is that a fair, simple example of data? And then behavior is, something like this. Right? A little function that does something. Maybe it does something for the user, like in this case, it has a side effect. It actually outputs something to the terminal. Or some functions don't really have a side effect to the whole kind of application. They just kind of calculate something, like an adding function or something like that, right? They're not going to console log anything. They'll just return a value. Either way, they are behavior, right? You're manipulating data and doing something. We know that we can store data into variables, but we also know something else about how JavaScript works, right? We can actually take a variable and assign it behavior.
I have a question about that when, maybe you're going to get into this, but when you are assigning Greek there, you did put parentheses.
Exactly. Exactly. In fact, before that line, let me actually I skipped a step. Console.log greet. If I do this, greet is being called, right? The way I'm reading this line of code is like an onion, right? I'm going to kind of go actually inside out onion, right? Like I'm going to look at the core, because this is how JavaScript's running it. Again, control flow discussion, right? This larger expression involves an expression inside of it that needs to be evaluated for console log to know what to actually output here. There's got to be some string here that it needs to output. So we need to actually evaluate this in our heads before we can evaluate the console log. So I go ahead and evaluate this. What will be the value replaced here? In my head, what should I see here? What will get console logged if I do this?
Hello and whatever you input there.
So hello.
And blank.
Oh yeah, I forgot to put an input, right? So it would be like KV or something, right? So it would be like hello KV. Some of you I heard say something different, which I think, so in this case, are we sure that this is what it's going to do? What else could it do instead? Whoops, I put this again wrong. This won't actually output hello KV, will it? It will output hello KV here. But what will this line do? Undefined. So I'm actually going to see this execute. Greet will execute. It will go into line 8. Line 9 will run. We'll see a hello KV. But then this console log from line 12, let's label it. This particular console log, calling greet, colon, will not show the return value, but it will actually show undefined, because we talked about this in day 2, right? It's going to be the implicit return value is undefined. So what would happen if I do this? If I just console log without the parentheses on greet? In the back? It would print the function definition. So this depends on which environment you're in. But it will try and print the details of the function. And it depends. If you're in DevTools, it will be nicer. If you're here, it won't be as nice. Actually, in this case, it is actually nicer. It depends on what version of Node you're in, perhaps. Right? Sometimes it'll just be like function. You'll be like, that doesn't really help me. But at least I know it's a function that I'm dealing with. In this case, it actually outputs the details of that function. So this is like a developer-friendly output of the thing that you just tried to console log. Right? And the thing you try to console log isn't the return value of greet. It's the actual value of greet. There's a difference. Much like x, if I console log that, it would output 5, which is where x is pointing to. X points to 5. Greet points to a function. You saw this in Python Tutor, right? Where you'd have like these arrows but with a name pointing to a space in memory, like a box, with function written in it, right? So if that's the case, if I can access the value of function, if I can just get a handle on that function using its name, then can't I also assign it to a variable? Right? So if I console log it's not calling greet, it's looking up greet. Looking up say hello. And we're going to see say hello. Let me zoom in a little bit more. Is also as a variable pointing to the greet function. So we've given it a default name or variable greet, but we can have another variable that points to the exact same function. This is true of objects too, right? You can have an object defined at x, and then assign that object, that same object, to another variable y later. And now you have two pointers in memory pointing to that object. If you manipulate that object, both of them will see that change because they're just pointing to that object. The same is true of functions. You guys with me so far? Yep.
Whenever you call greet, it goes back to function. You don't need parentheses after greet.
You don't need parentheses if you don't want to invoke or call the function. There's a difference. There's a difference between this, invoking a function, and this, which is not calling or invoking, but referencing. So in JavaScript anyway, it depends on the language. In JavaScript, these are two very different things. One is, tell me about this function, and let me access the function itself. The other is, call the function and execute its behavior. Right? This is what we're used to doing, and this is what we do 99% of the time with functions. Maybe not 99% of the time, but the majority of the time, this is what we do with functions. Line 12, we execute the function after we've defined it. Right? I'm saying there's also this that you should start getting comfortable with, which is referencing functions. Because that will be a powerful tool, as we'll see with certain problems.
Can I see what the result was again? Just to see what
How are you even able to see from there? How's this?
better?
Okay.
I can still see this again.
Okay.
But again, just want to see what the result was for the last console log.
Yeah, absolutely. Sorry about that. So let me just comment out this and execute it again clearly.
So it actually shows you the, okay, makes
It's
sense.
the exact same output on the right side,
Right.
which is say hello is pointing to that exact same. If it was an object, you'd see the same thing. You'd see the exact same object again.
Yeah. Okay.
If I manipulated that object on X, you would see, and I printed Y, because they're pointing to the same object, you'd see the change, right? You always see the exact same output for both X and Y.
Right.
Similar here, greet and say hello are the exact same function. It has not created a copy of that function. So I only have one function in memory, and then I have two variables that are pointing to that function, is one way to look at that. Technically not a variable greet, but you know, whatever. You view it like that. This is an important thing to kind of get as a fundamental. So how many people want a little bit more clarity on this? Right? Can you ask a question to help me kind of approach this a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just getting different, like in the vagrant terminal, different output from what you're getting. So maybe it's just something that's between the terminal and the virtual output.
Are you using the REPL to try this out? Are you using Node, like in the interactive Node shell, or are you using a file and then running the file?
I'm using the interactive Node.
Yeah, that will have slightly different behavior, because it will execute each line that you run. But as long as you ignore, like when you run a line, you ignore the statement that comes out right after, because it might say like undefined or something, and actually look at your deliberate console log, then it should be the same. So you have to kind of do a little bit of filtering, because you're slightly different. It just console logs everything that you execute by default, and then you're console logging on top of that. So for example, if I open up the Node shell here and do a console log, I'm going to see two outputs, even though I just did one, right? It's also giving me the value, the return value of console log. And so maybe that's what's throwing you up, or maybe it's something else.
Right, it just said function.
Oh, yeah, so if I have a function. Yeah, so that's interesting. So if I do function greet here, maybe that's what I was confused about. Right, here's a function. It doesn't have to have anything right now. Or let's just make it console log something. Right? And then I do greet. It does the thing that I thought it would do with the file, which is, it's not giving me any details. So yeah, you're right in that.
It's a function in its focus.
Yeah. Oh, so that's what you were confused about.
Yeah, I was just
Yeah.
like, I'm not getting the same thing, but now I'm understanding.
Right. It's just, you know how I said it depends on the environment? Yeah, so in Chrome DevTools, it'll be different. In the file output, it's a little bit different. Yep.
The query wants to know what are the cases you use to reference a function without trash.
What are the cases? Yeah, so we're going to be talking about that. What are the cases in which we're going to be actually referencing the function versus versus calling the function? But this,
Is this similar to where you use references so as to break up loops?
is it similar to where you need to reference your loop so as to break two loops? I don't know what that means actually. Can you? Oh, if you have a nested loop inside a loop. I don't think that will be a parallel if you wish to break both of them. Okay. I'll look into that a little bit later. Maybe there's something I don't know about that that is throwing me off. So far, so good with this. Any other kind of people, any other clarity that I should be giving on this?
So I guess kind of just going down where we're heading. So now if you want to use say hello, the input originally greet had an input value that you could get for name, right? So would you then say hello brackets KV, next to say hello, because say hello is now
Exactly. That's the other thing. That's the other thing to kind of close that loop, is to just show you that I can just call say hello just like I can call greet, right? So say hello will behave very much like greet because say hello has been assigned to point to the same function. And so I can use it just like,
why wouldn't you just use greet?
why wouldn't you just use greet is a great question. And so I'll get to that very, very soon. Yeah. So just again, the very last one is me saying hello, right? Which I'm using a different name for that greet function because I gave it a separate name, separate variable. We've already seen a little bit of this, but again, just to build the fundamentals before we get to the problem spaces. We have a function here as an example again called greet, and it's a declared function. But we've also seen function expressions before in the prep course as well as in week 1. So a function expression is when, well, if I can assign an existing function to a variable, why can't I just define it as such? So if there's an existing function here, and I can just say var say hello equals greet like we did, right? Instead of that, why not just say hello equals function greet, and then it does its thing. In this case, it's returning, not console logging. Slightly different behavior, but the function itself is not important. It's just being used as an example.
What you're saying is that's the same?
What I'm saying is that that's slightly different, but to us, in terms of what we can do with say hello and greet, is the same.
So now you can call either and it would do the same thing.
That's right.
That's just a lot more code though, for everything you want to call it.
Yeah, it seems a little bit, and I think I talked about this a little bit in my last lecture, like it seems a little bit over to give it 2 names, but some people actually believe that you should, for reasons I'm not going to get into, to do with debugging. But really what it comes down to is the language allowing you to do this, which you may have seen. You may actually come across code that you adopt in your job or for whatever software you take on, where majority of function, if not all of them, are actually defined this way, as a style, as a convention. Since JavaScript has 2 ways of declaring functions. Function declarations, as we see above, that's commented out, and function expressions, where they're defined and assigned to a variable, but they're defined without a name. So this, the right-hand side here, is the value being assigned to the left-hand side. Agreed? And that value is a function. Agreed? Except the one thing that's changed here is that function has no name. So it is a nameless function. But that's not the accurate term for it.
But is it not just taking the say hello and putting it in?
It technically, from a JavaScript runtime perspective, doesn't have a name, which is why, and that, that's kind of a gotcha, where when it comes to debugging, you may run into like, instead of it telling you the name of the function where the error happened, it will just say anonymous. So the function actually has no name, which is why, based on this limitation and power, right, depending on how you look at it, you may be better off giving it a name. Depending on who you talk to, which company or which team you talk to, every company and team will have different kind of philosophies, no matter what language they're using or what frameworks they're using. And Airbnb, I believe, their JavaScript style guide says to both declare and assign to a variable a named function, not an anonymous function. I think it's not generally considered good. I think it can be, but I don't know actually. I don't know if it can be the same. We can try it out. So here's just different names. Yeah, and then I'm gonna change it up.
It's definitely from Victoria.
Okay, cool. I'll take a look. Hopefully it's not audio video issues. Okay, I see what you were saying. I don't know your name. Freeman. How do you pass arguments into a function when it's referenced to a variable? How do you pass arguments into a function when it's referenced to a variable? So we saw that in the previous exercise where say hello is a function that's assigned to the variable say hello. And therefore, when I'm passing in arguments, it's the exact same as when I'm calling greet. So if I was to say greet, I would do the same thing. Greet KV. Right? The node function, the values. We can see the exact same behavior, actually. They're almost copies of themselves. I hope that answers that question. OK, sweet. So coming back to file 2, we're going to name both of them the same. Yeah. So first, let's see this work. Make sure that's looking good. Right? It needs to take in name here. Right? Feeling OK about that so far? And my assumption is that I will see hello KV and then hello Nima. So just to keep it. Oh, interesting. So because it's actually defined, the behavior keeps changing. The behavior keeps huh?
Which one is funnier?
Greet is not defined.
Okay.
So interesting learning here. You can't actually call it directly after when it's defined like that. That might have changed. I don't know.
So
That's a good learning.
the style guide then?
So it's more to do with debugging. When that function throws an error in the call stack that Nima showed you, that that stack trace,
It's purely for when there's an error.
it's more to do with debugging, exactly. Yeah. Which I would argue you shouldn't. I haven't really run into the problem where, oh, I really need to know the name of that function because it still generally tells me more accurately than not the file name and the line number where that function was defined, generally. It's only when you're doing like some crazy, yeah, I don't want to get into that. I'll leave it there. There's certain cases where it helps, but they're fairly rare.
So do you want to rename greet and say hello?
So what happens if you do this? I have no idea, actually. We know this won't work. I don't know if that'll throw an error. I guess it works. But I'm not sure what happened there behind the scenes. I'd have to look into that. It's a good question. Not a super important one, but it's still a good question to really understand the internals of JavaScript. Yep.
Can we go over again if you can't call the function by its name when it's wrapped in variable like that, why would you give it a name?
It's yeah. I'm kind of regretting going into that a little bit. Why is it that you want to give the function a name as you declare it and then also assign it to a variable?
Sorry, it would work if you declared the function.
Yeah, if I declared the function first, as we saw in the previous line, if I declared it first and then assigned it, which we did exactly before,
Yeah.
I'm just doing that in one step,
Which feels redundant, but it works.
but it actually makes it do something different. But in most cases, you're not going to need for that function to have two names, right? You guys asked that question in the last file, like why are you giving it two names? Just let it have one name, right? At Lighthouse, my assumption is most mentors will be like, why did you do this? Just do this. But if you were working at Airbnb, they would force you to do it this way in their code review and say, do it this way. This is our convention. It's better to be consistent in the entire code base than to just be like, this is how I like it, right? I'm assuming they got burnt by something where this wasn't, or multiple times by not doing this when it comes to like those crazy edge cases, and maybe that was the reason. There's definitely a lot of debate in even just, should you declare functions this way, or is it just simpler to do this? People have different opinions on that. But do we see at least that this makes sense as a possibility? And that the other thing that we've exposed here as a new feature in JavaScript to you is you can have a function with no name.
But it has a variable.
Doesn't have to. I can just do this. I can remove that initial variable that it was assigned to and just define the function like that.
But then you can never call it.
But then I can never call it.
Yeah.
Exactly.
But it is possible with
But I believe it is possible. Because we actually do this quite a bit, just not necessarily all by itself, because that is zero value. I define a function never to be able to reference it ever again. And so the way it's done, I don't even know if that will actually execute. It may not actually execute as valid JavaScript just by itself, because what's the point? But it is, you'll see that you can do this without giving it ever a name. You can define a function, which sounds like crazy, like what? But you'll see that happen very soon. It's a little bit of a teaser to what's to come in this lecture. It is 9:53, so I'm going to leave it here, and then we're going to use what we've built as like review/fundamentals on functions and functions as values to really talk about types of problems and how we're going to solve them with functions, and specifically functions as values. So let's take a 5-minute bio break, and that'll give me an opportunity to get my water that I forgot. Cool. Testing, testing, make sure everything's okay. Audio should be working. All right, just checking on Victoria, making sure everybody's back there. Everybody seems back here, right? It's all good, mostly? All right. Thumbs up from Lindsay. So we left off talking about these anonymous functions that when you define them, it makes sense to give them, if we're not giving them a name, give them a variable. But they are still technically anonymous functions. Okay? And this was a logical step from the previous where we were like, well, if we can assign a previously declared function to a variable, why can't we do it in the same step? And then why can't we just take away that name since we're already giving it a name a la variable, right? All of this kind of building towards some kind of problem that hopefully we're able to solve with all of this. So problem. When we're writing a bunch of functions, we're often writing functions that like largely do something similar, but then do something different, slightly different. So, you know, maybe I'll try to use a different example that I normally do. Something a little bit more like that we do as humans, not necessarily computers do, and then we can do something that's a little bit more practical, more typical. If we were writing a function telling someone, and we're just going to use console log for this stuff, to go, I don't know, we just took a bio break, right? So to go to the kitchen and fill up on coffee, right? It might look something like this. Function, go to kitchen, and kitchen, if I can spell, and refill coffee. Right, something like that, just to kind of illustrate this example. We might then say, oh, we also need a function for this robot slash person to go to the kitchen and do something else. Go to the kitchen and refill water. Or go to the kitchen and clean up. Right? Things of that nature. Now there's different ways of refactoring this and making this less repetitive. What's the part here that we're noticing is repetitive? Going to the kitchen. Going to the kitchen seems to be shared amongst all of these functions. Right? So it's almost like we could use a separate function to just go to the kitchen. Agreed? So we would have a function like function go to kitchen. If I could spell that again, I don't know why I keep saying kitch. And I would just take this, right, and move it up here. As the first step anyway, right? And then I guess a better thing would have been to actually not do it that way, but to actually call go to kitchen in each of those lines, right? And then, whoops, we can paste that here. That seems like a reasonable refactor where it's like, okay, go to kitchen and refill coffee. Okay, the first I need to go to the kitchen and then do that. So this is one way to refactor that code, right? There is another way. I'm going to just command Z this because I think this one's more obvious and you can probably, so yeah, there we are. Sometimes it's actually better to define the action separately and then to call a function like go to kitchen So we'd have another function called go to kitchen, and then do this. So instead of just calling that function that all it does is go to the kitchen, it's actually a function that's responsible, that's a little bit more generic. That's like, not only do I want you to go to the kitchen, but I also want you to go to the kitchen and then do a specific behavior. The reason we're able to do this, remember that what do we normally pass into functions? We pass in inputs. These inputs are usually data. That's what we're used to doing. I pass in numbers, strings, objects. But if we note that functions are values and can be assigned to variables, which means they can be passed around, doesn't that also mean that they could be passed into functions? They're just values. Functions as values. It's like the number 5, right? There's a space in memory, and JavaScript keeps a note of where in memory that function is, and there's a value to that address in memory, some crazy number, and that number is what's being passed around, and it knows where to go look up that function. So how that would be implemented is, instead of this, now let me just comment all of this out. So here it would be console log going to kitchen, or went to kitchen, whatever you want to call it. And then, let's call it do something. A little bit more semantic. And then do something. So you kind of flipped it. Instead of these other functions being responsible for knowing that there's a function called go to kitchen and calling that function, now I can just call go to kitchen and then pass in some behavior. And I can just use this generic go to kitchen and execute one specific action type function. So how would I invoke this function? Does anybody want to take a guess? Even though I haven't shown it to you yet, you may be able to guess. Of course, I'm going to call the function by its name, right? Go to kitchen, and then function invocation needs parentheses. And then in here, I'm going to need to pass in a function.
Yeah, any one of the functions you commented out.
Yeah, but let's just redefine those. So now they're not going to be called go to kitchen. It'll just be called refill coffee, right? Maybe that takes, right? And maybe that's just a simple console log.
But I think you need to have the brackets in there for the refill coffee. But then do something has the brackets in the go to kitchen and then.
Yeah, you see what's changed here?
Because I want to experiment. Yeah.
There's, when do I want to call the function? It's when I get to the kitchen.
Yeah.
Because that's, line 7 only should happen when I'm in the kitchen. So I'm not calling the function. Remember about my first exercise I did before we started callbacks was how do you read the code? Function is defined, I'm not reading it. Function is defined, I'm not reading it. First line of code that I'm really reading in terms of what it's evaluating. Go to kitchen is being called, refill coffee. So first I need to understand where this is and what this is. This is a function. I am not calling the function. I'm referencing the function and passing it in. Oh, I haven't checked in on Victoria. Hopefully everything's going well. Okay. Victoria, feel free to throw in questions or comments as they come up. You've been great at that so far. So I'm passing in the value of this function that's defined up here to go to kitchen and then. And in here, it's saying, okay, first I got to go to the kitchen. So that's my console log for that. And then I actually have to do that thing. And that's the invocation of that function. Do something is just like if I was passing in the number 5. It's a variable, a local variable that's only accessible in that function. Normally, we are used to passing objects, strings, numbers in, but we should get more and more comfortable starting today passing functions into functions. This is getting into what's called functional programming. JavaScript is a language that supports functional programming. Not all languages support functions as values. They can't do this. JavaScript can. Other functional languages can. We don't want to get into the theory of languages, but feel free to write down and later Google examples of functional languages. And you'll also, is Java a functional language? Maybe a good discussion to read on Stack Overflow is probably where you'll land. What you'll find is JavaScript isn't a purely functional language. It also is object-oriented, which is not necessarily in competition, but is in competition with purely functional. So JavaScript allows you to do both work with objects, as you saw yesterday, right? And objects can be mutated, they can change, you can assign new properties to an object, things of that nature. Pure functional languages don't let you do that. JavaScript lets you do both. And therefore, it's more powerful. And also, as a result of being more powerful, with more power comes more confusion. Oh, sorry, more responsibility. Both. Both of those things. Yeah.
So my question is, what is the benefit, or is it even possible to do this, if you were to call Go to Kitchen and then refill coffee, and then call refill coffee then, and then with do something, I don't know, like what, like is it possible to do it that way? Because I have put functions with the call in the parameters of calling another function. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Like, you could potentially just be like, normally I do this. I call a function and take its return value and pass it into another function.
Yeah.
So in my mind, what's happening is,
So then you need
when
to
I
return.
when I run line 10 in my head, in order to call the outer function, I need to evaluate. Whatever this expression is inside these parentheses, I need to evaluate it.
Yeah.
If it's 5, it's very easy. It's the number. Oh, sorry, that's not 5. I know my numbers, I swear. But if it's a number, I know to express, like there's no math or anything I have to do. There's no jumping around in lines of code.
Yeah.
It's defined. If it's a string, same thing. If it's a variable name, x, then I have to go find x. And hopefully it's not a number. That's what I'm used to. Or an object, some kind of data. But now I'm saying it's, and if it's a function call, then in that case, I have to go and run that function, look at what its return value is, and in my head, I actually don't see refill coffee here. I would see the actual return value of refill coffee,
Right.
which right now is not returning anything.
Yeah.
So in my head, when I see just a variable name, a keyword like this, it's either a function name or a variable name, right? And I have to go find it. And so when I find it, it is the thing. It is not what it does, right? It is the function,
Yes.
not the return value. So not what it returns, but what it is.
And then that gets
Right.
passed and is called with do something in Go to Kitchen.
And then, yeah, just like we're used to seeing, okay, now in my head, this is now the first argument to this function, which is do something. Great. I'm glad that this is definitely going to cause a little bit of, oh my gosh, my brain is exploding. Does it make sense to create an object from Go to Kitchen and then other functions as methods? So objects and methods are something that we have briefly covered yesterday. But some of you may not be comfortable with that yet. Objects as methods is going to get more and more a thing. But in this case, Go to Kitchen is a verb. So to answer this question by Josh, it's actually a good question because it helps me speak to a point. Normally, a good litmus test for a function, should it be a function or an object, is if it's a noun or a verb. It's not always true, but like 99% of the time, if it's a verb, it's a function, or it should be. If it's a function, it should be a verb, right? Both of those should be the case. So if you see yourself naming a function not as a verb, you should question why you're doing that, right? And so in this case, going to kitchen is an action, a verb, and therefore it's some kind of behavior, and therefore it's a function. Yeah.
Just about like how JavaScript actually takes in this information, because if you put Go to Kitchen, then refill coffee, for say line 5, will it know to go and find it somewhere else in the document, or does it have to come at the very end?
Good question as well. Do the functions have to be declared in a certain order based on their dependency? Here you have refill coffee being defined second, and yet indirectly Go to Kitchen is using refill coffee. But the thing is, refill coffee is actually being used here on line 10 first and foremost, so that is after the function. But to answer your question more specifically, this function definition, even in this case, it's being used in line 10, refill coffee, can still be defined after line 10. And that's kind of, again, a weirdness or a quirkiness of JavaScript that allows you to do that, whereas other languages like Ruby, you cannot do that.
It's almost like it just kind of looks at the whole thing and then
Yeah.
processes
So if in Ruby, or I think also Python and other languages, I think maybe even Java, C as an example, you can't do that. You have to define the function before you use it. In JavaScript, it does 2 passes. The first pass is just kind of looking at, it's doing kind of hoisting essentially. And so it's already knows that that function exists, which is why in Python tutor, the first thing you see when you run the file or run the code is everything is already defined. Everything that was in the top scope is already defined. But anyway, I digress. It's a bit of a digression. I want to get further along with some of the problems. So one of the things I made the mistake of doing here is write a lot of code that I didn't run yet. Okay, that's bad. Don't do that. So let's actually go ahead and run this. What do we expect will happen? I expect that it will go into, unless there's some typos or something, it will go into here, call go to kitchen and then, which will output going to kitchen. Then it will pass, it will also have passed in refill coffee, so it will have called refill coffee. So we'll see going to kitchen, yo, it's coffee time. So we can see it behaving the way I've kind of promised you that it would behave, right? And now we can have potentially other functions like refill water. Right? And now we can just call that same function. It's more of a generic function that allows us to do something in the context of something else. To do something in the context of something else. To grab coffee in the context of being in the kitchen. Do you see that? That's quite powerful. In this small example, it's like, well, yeah, but I could have just called that function, go to kitchen, before, right? Like I showed in the very first example here. I could just call go to kitchen here, and then I'm in that context. But not always is that easy. In some cases, this is easier. And we'll see more examples of that to make that concrete. What are some real JavaScript examples where this is used is our next step, in case you're wondering. Because this one's not really realistic, right? This is just describing human behavior versus something that you'll need to do even potentially today with software. I saw hands go up. I don't want to ignore them. So yeah.
What if you wanted to call a function or maybe a string to another function?
Yeah, that's a good question. So what if like you're passing in something that could be one thing or another thing. It could be a number or a string. It could be a function or a number. In that case, you would actually have to check the type of that thing. Right? The function would then have to be, and there are libraries that you're going to use very soon. I think the earliest will be in week 2, maybe even earlier than that you won't even necessarily realize it, but that particular function you're calling is going to allow you to send multiple things in. And it will just have if statements. If you pass me a function, I'm going to do this. If you pass me a number, else if, I'm going to do this. So you can do that in JavaScript using type of. Type of the thing equals function. That means it's a function. But I'm not done with my step. That was a bit of a digression. My step is, remember we talked about how you could just have an anonymous function? We talked about that, but we're not talking about anonymous functions here at all. So actually, if you are never going to refill coffee more than once, and you just need it that one time that you're going to the kitchen, then you actually, conventionally, I'm just going to hide this for now. You're not actually going to do function refill coffee and then pass it in, because that's, more lines of code. I can just not give that function a name, because I never need to reference it more than once. I just need it once to refill that coffee. And then, instead of referring it by name, I literally pass it in as I define it. This should cause a little bit of confusion, so I'm going to give it a little bit of time on the screen for you to read what's happening there. I took that function, removed its name, and just like how I should ideally be looking at code, which is when I see that variable name, get coffee, I should just see the function there in my eyes. I should get used to seeing other things that are actually compared to what's actually written on the screen, and I actually just pasted in what I was supposed to be seeing there. I was supposed to be seeing a function there.
And the code normally formatted?
Yeah, that's how it's formatted.
Wow, that last fraction is great.
Yeah, but notice how I've highlighted too, right? Because I've highlighted that way, it helps. Or if I go to this particular thing, a good editor will highlight the closing bracket for it. And so when I select these different brackets, the underline that it's hard to see is moving. Some people prefer their editors to actually highlight, like full-on background. on that particular bracket, because you do very quickly in real world programs get into like 5, 6 brackets being closed at once, right? So do we agree that based on all the fundamental stuff that we talked about in the previous files, in the previous part of this lecture, that this makes sense because we have an anonymous function, never assigned to a variable, because it's only needed once, and so might as well just pass it in as it's needed. Very common tactic, something you'll see across almost every single JavaScript script or app or whatever you use. You will see this behavior. And notice how it works. Sorry, go ahead.
The brackets there on line 3, decide do something. It's just ignoring those now because you put a function in the
There's no difference in terms of what's happening in this line. This function is exactly the same. It's getting a function inside of it. It's getting a function passed via do something.
Yeah, but I'm just saying that line 3 has the opening and closing brackets.
Yep.
And then you've also got that now in your do something down below. So it's kind of double multiple sets of brackets in there, and that doesn't bring an error, obviously.
Oh, these sets of brackets here. Yeah, so this is a function definition, right? Normally there'd be a name here. You still have this to indicate that this is a function. This is not the function being called. It's what are the arguments in the function, right? And so that's why it's required. This is not taking in any arguments, but it's not a function call. It's a function definition or declaration being declared, right? And so do not confuse this parentheses with the invoking parentheses. Without the keyword function, we're invoking a function, right? There's the name and then the parentheses to invoke that function. Notice how I'm very deliberate with my words. I'm not saying brackets. I'm saying parentheses as much as possible. There's various different types of brackets. I call these ones open stash and closed stash brackets because they look like sideways mustaches. So they're open mustache, closed mustache. The square brackets, I just say open square, closed square, or something of that nature, right? These ones are parentheses. How are we doing? Yeah. I have not used the word callback function yet. Intentionally. Because I tried as much as possible deliberately to name it afterward. Instead of naming it first and then conjuring some image in your head and then trying to change that image in your head. Right? I don't know. It seems to work most of the times. And so, yes, that is a very good question. You said callbacks. Is this callbacks? Absolutely, this is callback. What's happened is go to kitchen and then is actually a function that receives a callback function. Right? It's an anonymous function behaving like a callback. Why do you think it's called a callback? Why those two specific words into this one word called callback? Yep, in the back, sorry, your name? Aiden, go ahead. Yeah, you're passing the definition to be used later on, to be called later on, to be invoked later on. So invoke back is probably hard to say, right? Invoke later, There are other names for callbacks. I'm not going to throw more names at you, but just know that there are other names. They're not as nice. You can look them up. I prefer to just, it's a callback function. That's what JavaScript, it's pretty common to say callback function. So why is it callback? Because it's being called back. I am not calling it here. I'm just passing it in, and I'm not, if I was using some other code that's responsible for going to the kitchen, I never actually call this function. I just pass it in as behavior. What's a good analogy of that? A further analogy. It's like something where I actually need something done, but I'm not going to do it. So it's like make a phone call and then, call a friend, like Lifeline, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, or whatever that game show was. It's like I just want to call them and tell them to do something and then call me back when they're done. I'm busy with other stuff. Here's a pile of resumes. What's your name? Peter. Here's a pile of resumes. I want you to select ones that have 2 years of JavaScript experience, and then call me back with those. Give me just that smaller pile back. Right? That's a real world example of Peter, did you say? Yeah. Terrible with names. Peter is a function that's more generic not to offend Peter in any way, where he can take in any pile of resumes as well as some instructions on how to filter them down. And then I don't have to do that. I just tell him instructions on how to do it, and he does that work. And now I have this generic function that can just take in resumes as well as some additional instructions, another function, a callback function, to check how to look at each resume. Oh, does it have 2 years of JavaScript experience? No. Yes. No. Yes. Right? Peter goes away and does that, and then gives me back the result, the smaller set of resumes. That's another maybe more real-world example of how you would use a generic function that takes in some instructions. In this case, the instruction was to go get coffee. In that case, it's to reduce an array to a smaller array. Do you see that? In fact, we're going to actually look at an example as well. So one of the things I want to either introduce or recap, depends on if you've already seen it or not, is this thing here. It's a for each function. Notice how for each is being called here. It's being called on an array of names, names.forEach. And then what's being passed into for each? A function, right? And what does that function do? It's an anonymous function, great answer. And all it does is, just for simplicity's sake in the lecture, it's just console logging each function, each item in that array, is what it seems to me. So it seems like for each, even without reading documentation, and just by inferring by its name and what's being passed in, is responsible for going through each item in the array and executing that specific instruction that we talked about with Peter. And that instruction is for each of them, please do this. And in this case, it's console log each thing to the screen. So let's make sure that works. Oh, not name, node, for. And we see that happen. We're already used to doing for each loops in a different way, right? Using a for var I equals 0, r is less than length. Going forward, if you write a loop that's responsible for going from the beginning to the end of an array, and you're using a for loop, that's considered bad. We've taught you that to get comfortable with that type of loop. It's the most powerful type of loop because you have full control over many different aspects of the loop. But a less powerful but easier to write and read is the for each loop. You already have the array, and you're saying, on the array, I want a for each. By the way, we did objects yesterday, right? And what is the notation of calling methods on objects? Dot. What are we seeing here? Dot. So what is for each? If I asked you, what is for each, you would say it's a function, but you'd be more specific in answering. It's a property that points to a method, exactly. If you're being more specific, it's a property on the array, but a property is more generic, right? It could be a value, it could be anything. It's a property on the array that points to a method. Or you could just skip that step and say it's a method, right?
So I was Googling objects yesterday, and everything referenced basically that array and are an object.
Arrays are an object, yeah, exactly.
They have a property.
Yeah. You know, if I just do type of
Right.
on an array, I get back object. It would have been nice if it said array, but you get object.
Can you do anything with that for each if you only wanted to do 3 of them?
Yeah, so this is a great question by, I forgot your name already, Aaron. Can you do like more powerful things that you could do with the traditional for loop? Like, you know, step through multiple, like step every second, or just go through a few of them? Like, no, you cannot. So this is specifically a more like, because this is like, I don't know, 80% of what you're doing with arrays, going from the beginning to the end, right? Think about how many times you've actually not done it that way. From the beginning to the end, I want to encounter all of them. I talked about filtering that pile of resumes for Peter. He's not going to just go through a few of them. He's going to go through all of them, unless he's being lazy at his job, which might happen, right? Yep. Yeah, so that's actually something we're going to implement in lecture, because you can't. We're going to implement our own for each, or maybe we'll do a for each backward, because that doesn't exist. Before I do that, question in the back? Yeah, so here is the arguments for each. And if I look up the documentation for each, so I would go, either W3 schools or MDN on for each, I would be able to see what things it takes in. And I mean, this is exactly what we're already doing, right? But in terms of its definition, right? It's basically this here. Now there's like these square brackets that say that you can actually also pass in a this arg. We're not worrying about that. That's very rare that you're doing that. So that's square brackets in documentation means optional, right? But required is this function callback. Oh, and look, it also tells you in the callback, it will always pass in the current value, right? You see that? Which is our name, or in this case, they call it the element, whatever you want to call it in that particular function. There's going to be the first argument that's always passed in is going to be the element, therefore you can console log it. But I just learned something. Well, faking that I learned something. There's also index. And then there's also array. So like, I can actually, because JavaScript's very forgiving, right? I can accept one argument or two or three, and hopefully they're passed in. Hopefully, maybe they're not. So I can actually here also take in a second argument that will be passed in. So maybe I want to not only traverse through all of the resumes, but also keep an idea of which one am I on? Am I on the first 0th one? Am I on the last one? I have that number to help me do something with that number. Maybe I need that number for some logic. Yep, question from Shmoon?
Yeah, so the for each is basically just like a shortcut of actually a loop with I. Like you just used I.
Yeah, exactly.
Declare I as a variable. Like
Exactly.
the chain within for each has got
So the question is, sorry to cut you off.
Yeah, that's good.
So the question is, it seems to me like for each is really just a shortcut or another way of writing a specific use case of for, which is go from the beginning to the end, one step at a time, not two steps at a time. And it just does that part of the original for loop. And that's exactly what I'm showing you. Yeah. And so whenever you have that use case, it's expected or idiomatic. It's an idiom in JavaScript that you're going to do it this way on an array or collection versus the more verbose for loop that is more cognitive load to read and write.
Right.
Okay, but right now this might feel like more cognitive load because you're not super comfortable with writing code where you have a nested function inside of another function invocation. I'm calling for each, invoking it, but I'm also passing in a function. Whoa, crazy nesting happening. I need to get used to that. But when you get used to that, this becomes less cognitive load and much easier to read and write. Yep.
Does it have to be an anonymous function that you pass it to the for each?
Does it have to be an anonymous function? No. Anytime you declare a function, you can give it that name.
Then can you call that function somewhere else?
I'm not sure. I don't think so, because we had that experiment where like I couldn't call greet, even though I had declared it.
So it might go, right?
But that's because you gave it a variable and
No, but I think it'll have the same behavior here, but we'll leave that experiment because I'm short on time. You can experiment with that after. It's just not generally something you would need to do or should be doing. It would be non-idiomatic again. Yep. Yep. Yeah, that's actually a good point, right? Like if we needed to do this particular complicated logic, right now it's not complicated. Like going and getting coffee might have been like multiple steps, right? Really giving instructions on like press this button on the machine, then do this. It's a lot of things, and maybe we need to do it multiple times. I don't want to have to like paste that function in 3 times. I would just define that function called grab coffee, and then just give it the name here, right? In this case, it's print name, and it would be var print name equals that function, or function print name, right? This is also acceptable. Works just the same, right? Maybe after lecture, what you can do as an exercise is take some of these and run them through Python Tutor, and maybe even change, oh, this time it's defined inline, this time it's defined before as a variable, and see how that changes the behavior in terms of how Python Tutor shows you the output visually. I'll be sending you these files, of course. But since we're at 10:36, I want to go a little bit further, okay? Okay, I guess I'm gonna be finishing at 11 if that's okay with everybody, and I'm gonna be actually implementing our own for each so that we fully understand how the hell is this thing working, because I don't think we understand it yet. Is that a fair assumption? I mean, I kind of showed you an example of a function that takes in a callback and executes it. That was the go to kitchen and grab some and do something. But we're going to do it again with something that's a little bit more common, like for each, or maybe we'll implement for each backward or something. So I have this next file, my for each, in which case I can either implement for each or for each backward, whatever I feel like. How about we do for each backward? Yeah? So let's actually implement for each backward in an incremental fashion, using a little bit of that error-driven development, but not obviously letting it slow us down too much. Okay? So how it would work is I would call the function for each backward, pass in some data, right? Because one thing I'm going to do differently is it's not going to be on the array. Notice how where I call it here, it's array dot for each. I'm going to do for each and then pass in the array. Okay, it's just simpler. I don't want to do more advanced JavaScript than I need to already because it's already blowing your minds a little bit. So we're not going to do the extra step of adding it to the array prototype. Ignore I said that, right? We're just going to be defining it as a standalone function that just takes in the array. We can still accomplish a for each that way. This is just fancier, where I don't have to pass in the array. Okay? So I'm passing in the array. And then I'm supposed to pass in some like logic, some behavior on what to do, right? So that's going to be my callback. This is a terrible name, but we're just doing it so it's very obvious right now, and then we'll give it a better name later. Actually, that's not what we're going to do. I'm just going to do for each backward on the data, and it's going to just do a specific thing. So for each backward, print. We're just going to do a generic function, a non-generic function, a very specific function, and then we're going to make it generic. Okay? So for each backward, please print. Okay? My expectation here is that there'll be an error. Correct? The error will be that it can't find that function.
Yeah. Well, yeah. And also data's not defined.
And also data is not defined. Yeah.
But the first error, yeah.
It depends on the language. In other languages, it would say data is not defined before for each is not defined. But because JavaScript does two passes, it encounters the function problem first, I think. That's why. Anyway, we're going to have to define that function that takes in some things, right? Things to print. I'm just being more verbose with my naming. They're not necessarily the best names right now. And then I would actually implement this, but of course, step by step. So now data is not defined. I need to define data. Whatever that is, right? A bunch of things. In this case, they're all disparate types. Doesn't matter. Right? And now what I expect is no error, but no real output either. So how am I going to go ahead and implement this for loop? Right? For var I is equal to things to print dot length minus 1. Is that right? Because we're starting at the, if it's 4 items, I want to start at 3.
Yes.
I is, while I is greater than or equal to 0, because I want to still make sure I get to 0. And I'm going to go I minus minus, one step at a time, decrement I, please. And then I'm going to console log just I for now, because I'm working iteratively, but we'll quickly replace that. And so I should get 3, 2, 1, 0, because there's 4 items in this array. And really, I want to be outputting things to print at I. I'm doing both, I and things to print at I, just to kind of see the index as well as the value being printed out. Right? So now I should see object things 5 hello. So far, are you guys with me? Cool. I think I'm done. Isn't that what I was supposed to do for the more specific function? Now, as I need for each more and more in my application, I'll be like, I'm doing for each backward scan resumes, for each backward do something else. Right now, I'm going to have that same problem with the go to kitchen and do something. Wouldn't it be nice if I could just say for each backward, and then I'll tell you what to do, not something specific. Make a more generic function. Right? And so really, we're going to turn this function. We're going to keep it there as a commented out thing, but we're going to redefine it to be more generic. So I'm just going to comment that out, repaste it here, and we're going to modify it. This is just for historical records. Okay? So here's our for each backward print, and we're going to turn it into a generic function. So actually, it's not going to print. It's just going to for each backward, and then it's going to take in the things, but it's also going to take in do something. So for each backward, do something, but also you need the data. You need the resumes in order to actually go through them. Right? Right? And so things to print is already being passed in, so we have that. Do something is being passed in, and nothing's being done with it. And it's not really being passed in. I'm just passing in the data, which is defined up here. Let me bring that down so we can see it. So we're not actually going to presume that there's going to be printing here. We can't presume anything. It's a generic function. We can't console log here. Agreed? What are we going to do as the generic function? We're going to use the callback. We're going to call it, right? So I would say do something. I call it, right? And this whole console log actually becomes my callback function. Now, just for like us to be able to visualize it, I'm going to define it separately, but then I'll move it in. Okay? So here I'm going to have function do print each, right? Which will take in the item, and then it will console log the item. Just keep it simple for now. Takes in an item, or print item, let's call it. Not even print each. Print item is more specific, because print each implies that it does it on multiple things. But we don't. This function doesn't care how many things. Just give me an item, I'll print it. Right? It's just a wrapper around console log. And so I would just pass in print item, not calling print item, but passing print item. Do we agree? I'm passing in the behavior of print item that is previously defined elsewhere. How's Victoria doing? I haven't checked in on them. So far, so good. Okay. Somebody's keeping an eye on that Slack channel for me, right? Thank you. Aaron, right? Is Aaron? But did I get your name right?
Yeah.
Yes. Accomplishment. Will this work? Will this error? What is our hypothesis? Yep, in the back, name is Aiden. You think we need to make print item a variable? I think it doesn't matter as long as it has a name. So it could be done this way, or as an anonymous function, which I give it as a variable, which I assign to a variable. So we could do it this way. This is technically more idiomatic JavaScript, technically. So you're right that this is slightly better, but it has the same behavior in this context. Peter? Oh, yeah, that's right. I made a mistake here. The function has been renamed to just for each backward, right? So that would have been a typo error. Can't find for each print. So we fixed that. Print item is a thing. It's right here. It's being passed in as a second argument. Therefore, our second argument here is do something.
What is item going to be populated?
That's a good question. I left that blank intentionally just to see if people would ask that question, or we would run it and see a problem. So what we're doing here is we're calling this function. This is the function. So when I see this now in my eyes, I'm seeing this. Right? So I'm seeing a function that takes in a parameter and console logs it. So here's that function. Call isn't passed in anything. So when you don't pass in something to a function, what is its first argument going to be? Undefined. So I'm going to see a bunch of undefined is my hypothesis, is the correct hypothesis. But at least we are seeing 4 undefined. That is a step in the right direction. Because there's 4 items. Exactly, there's 4 items. It's being called 4 times. So a callback doesn't have to be just called once. You know, with the coffee example, it was called once. Right? Go to the kitchen and do something. They go to the kitchen once, and then they call the do something once. Here, the callback is being called numerous times. And we're going to fix it by passing in the item. How do I pass in the item? Can I just say item? There is no item referenced in this scope. Things to print at I. Or I can just say var thing equals that. If it's easier for you to read that, fine. But you should get comfortable being able to just see these 2 lines of code when you really just see this. Right? In your head, you can see a separate variable, temporary variable, if you will, while you're executing that 1 line of code in your head. So now I expect that it will actually print out all the things backwards. And it works. But we're going to, I see confused looks, and I'm not surprised to see that. This is a lot of code that we've written together, and the control flow is confusing now. You can probably start to appreciate why it's important to really force yourself to read in terms of certain control flow. So let's take that practice that we started the lecture with and apply it here. Okay, where should my eyes land, and what should I be doing? Somebody walk me through that. Yep, sure.
Look at the
This should be the first line, right? This,
line.
yep. So we have data defined. Cool.
Find data,
Right.
but that doesn't do anything.
Right. But we know that that's what it's called. So if we ever need to come back to it, we can come back to it there.
We know this is called data.
Then you're on this line.
We know there's a function called read backward, and that does something.
That does something. We don't care what. And we know it takes in 2 arguments.
Yeah.
Right?
And then you might look.
You should be jumping. You should not be reading the contents of that function. Correct?
Okay, don't read the
Yeah.
content. And then you find another variable, print item, which does something. Function.
It's a function. Don't care what that function does.
Don't care. And then you actually do something. Call a function read backwards.
Now I'm passing in 2 things. So in my head, I shouldn't be seeing data here. I should be seeing the array defined in line here.
Yeah.
And also here, I should be seeing this function defined in line here.
Yeah, you remember the variable from the first line that is called this function. Data.
Yep.
Yeah.
So print item is this function.
Print item.
So that's essentially pasted here.
Yeah.
And data is this array, and that's essentially pasted here.
Yeah.
This is also valid JavaScript, right? But I'm just going to undo that just so it's easier to follow, or potentially harder to follow. It depends on your preference. And then now this function is executed, right?
Yeah.
So now your eye should go here, I believe. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay.
And then you can add data and print item, which is hello 5 things, brackets, and console log item into read backwards. Yeah.
Yeah, so now you're kind of going to your traditional, loops. We've already done that in terms of how to read those.
Yeah.
But we know that it's going to happen multiple times. And it's operating on things to print, which is that array that was passed in. So 4 items. And we're starting at the end and whatever. And then for each time, so let's just look at the first run, which is at 3. I is 3. We're saying 3 here now. Our I should see 3 here. And we're saying things to print 3. We know things to print is the first argument, which is the array, which is this thing here. So hello, right? And so hello is being passed in here.
Well, it'd be 3, right? It'd be the last one.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, my bad. It would actually be the object being passed in.
Going backwards.
Yeah, we're going backwards. So it'd be the object being passed in here. So now we're saying do something with the object. What is do something? It's actually the print item function. And therefore, the print item is being called that takes in an item and prints it.
Which is the last item in the data, which is the mustache bracket.
Yeah, which is the object, right? Empty object?
Yeah.
Yeah.
The mustache bracket.
Yeah, you just want to say mustache brackets because it sounds cool. Yeah. But ultimately, you've passed in the object here and you're console logging the object. Then for the next iteration, it's going to be things and so on, right? I'm going to leave this up for another minute, just because I feel like sometimes it's very easy for me to just kind of move on and assume that you got it.
Going backwards on the for loop,
You don't normally use for loops that way, but to be honest, if you're going forward, you're just going to use for each from now on. So it's only when you're doing something more custom that you're really going to do this type of a loop. Like multiple steps, you know, step 2 each time, or don't start in the middle, something like that, right? And so in this case, start at the end and work your way to the forward is, you know, where the more powerful for becomes useful. This is still not fully idiomatic because unless I'm using print item multiple times, I'm actually just going to paste it in here. I'm not going to actually do it this way. I'm going to just comment that out.
So what you're saying is basically don't clutter the program with variables you're only going to use once, just put them in there.
Yeah, exactly. Don't clutter your program with variables that you're only going to use once. Said really well by Clive. So just, you know, similar to how if you're just going to use 5 once in a specific as an argument, you're not going to say var 5 equals 5. You're just, you know, you're not going to do this and then pass it in. You're just going to pass it in. Same thing with the function. If you're going to use that particular thing multiple times, then maybe it makes sense to give it, you know, a pointer, a variable. Exactly. I'm going to just scroll up back a little bit and zoom out so you can see all of this code again. There it is. There's not a lot of lines of code here, but there's a lot of jumping in control flow. And that's what causes the confusion, right? It's another lesson learned. It's not about how many lines of code it is for the complexity. It's things like the control flow, right? And how many different scopes there are, how many different functions there are, how they're actually working together. I hope I did a reasonable job at my journey from reading code to defining functions as values. Let's do a quick recap in our last 5 minutes instead of doing another example, which I sometimes do. Or should we do another example? I don't think we have enough time. But what I will actually say is there's a built-in filter. And I'll just show it to you. This is array, instead of array for each, there's also array filter. We talked about filtering resumes via Peter. This is the function that's built into JavaScript, just like for each, to do that. It will just take in one callback function because it's already operating on an array. Here's my array. Items. So we would say items.filter. We would say, please, here's the callback to only select odd numbers, because I only care about odd numbers. So filter this array of numbers down to just the odd numbers, please. Or it could have been resume objects that you then use to reduce down to resumes you care about, as an example. Right? In this case, we go through each number. And this function is assumed to be called how many times? Once, 0 times, or multiple times? All of the times, exactly. However many items there are, that's how many times that function is going to be called. And what is it returning? What is it returning? I didn't hear that. Say it louder or someone else. No. What is that? The function that I've highlighted, what is it returning? True or false is the correct answer. It is an expression that evaluates, it's an equality expression, right? Some number is not equal to some other number. That's a false, right? Or sorry, that's a true or false, right? Boolean.
So it's going to return like true, false, true, false, true, false, true. Like that's what's going to keep printing.
And what do you think filter is doing? What can you deduce about what filter is doing and what it needs the callback to be doing in order to do its job? It seems like filter needs a callback function that returns a Boolean. Is that a fair statement? And that Boolean does what? It's either true or false. And therefore, what does it do?
Check.
It tells the filter function if it's in or if it's out.
Right.
Is it in the yes pile or is it in the no pile? And then it returns the yes pile at the end. And so at the end, unlike for each, which returns nothing, filter, we care about that result set. We care about what was the resulting array after you run your filter. So it actually returns an array at the end. And that array is the yes pile.
Can we see it?
Yeah, of course.
The filter's only going to return true.
Okay.
So the callback function is called for each item, just like with for each. However, it's actually looking at, okay, what does this callback do? Oh, it returned a true, yes pile. Oh, this time it returned a false. This item goes in the no pile. And then finally, it returns the yes pile.
To get it to return a no pile, you can just change the parameters of the function.
Yeah.
If you wanted it to return
If you wanted to return the other one, I could just say,
just
get me,
rid of
get.
the exclamation point, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. You could have it do the opposite, right? That's just flipping the. It's still going to return the yes pile, but you've just decided what to put in the yes pile is different. This is a real world use case. These for each filter, there's a bunch of functions like this on arrays that are very commonly used because these are common things that you're doing. You're taking data and you're reducing it down to some smaller amounts, right? Or filtering it is a better semantic word, not reducing it. Or you are iterating through it using for each. Or there's other functions that I don't want to necessarily name them yet, but you can look them up, or they'll come up organically. We'll go with you first, and then Shmoo after. Yeah, question or comment? Can you use a for each and do the same thing? Of course, right? You can do this yourself without using a function like this. But if you're just finding yourself constantly filtering arrays down, why do the work of looping? Notice I'm not doing any looping here. Filter function is doing the looping for me, most likely, right?
But for each does the loop for you too, right?
Well, but you have to tell it to, this is also the filter.
This is a more specific for each. It's like for each, please put it in the yes pile or no pile, and then tell me the yes pile.
You'd have to tell it to basically compile a new array within it. Okay. Okay.
So as usual, I'm at 1 minute to the end, and I'm going a little bit over time. So I'm just going to do a quick recap of everything we covered. This is what we said we would cover, right? First, functions can be values, and therefore assigned to variables or passed into other functions. Agreed? Functions can be defined with a name or without. That would be anonymous functions. When we find ourselves needing more generic functions, let's take advantage of being able to pass functions, into other more generic functions, more specifically. By the way, I specifically did not give it a name. These generic functions also have a name. They're called higher order functions. Don't worry too much about the name, but in case you do see it, higher order functions are functions that operate on other functions. This is a math term, not a specifically computer science term, but it's also used in, because we're using functions here just like in math, and so we use the same terminology. So higher order functions are functions that operate on other functions.
So would the higher order function in our example be the go to kitchen?
Go to kitchen and then is an example of a higher order
that's
function
right. Go to kitchen
because
and
it
then
takes a callback. For each backward is an example of a higher order function. For each that's built in is an example of a higher order function,
Okay.
and so on. There are another type of higher order functions that I'm not going to cover. It's not in scope right now. They're more rare, which are functions that return functions. But like, let's not worry about those. You're not going to be writing those very commonly in the real world / bootcamp. But you may be using them, but you may not be declaring, you may not be defining them as much. Very common use cases of such higher order functions are for each and filter and other array methods. Right? And we defined at least one of our own, and then we didn't define filter. We could have redefined filter, or we could have done the opposite of filter called reject. You know, if it returns true, that means put it in the no pile. Don't put it in the yes pile. We could have done that exercise. What I would argue is that it's a exercise in what we've already done with for each backward. Perhaps you should, after class, try to implement your own filter or reject in the same way that I implemented for each backward. It wouldn't be on the array, so therefore it would take 2 arguments. It would be taking in, it would just be called my filter or something, and it would take in the array first, and then it would take in the function. Just like our for each backward took in 2 arguments. Right? So I'll put that in as a challenge.
So reject doesn't exist right now. Okay.
I think reject, I'm not sure if it exists in JavaScript. It does exist in Ruby. I don't know if it exists in JavaScript or not. It should take in, it probably does. I don't know, we could Google that pretty quickly, but I'm out of time. It should take in 2 arguments, the array, and then the callback. Same thing as before, same thing as for each backward. Okay? So you might want to spend, I don't know, half hour, whatever it takes, pair program that maybe as your first thing, because it's fresh in your mind. And then for those of you who are still finishing up on yesterday, feel free to do that first before you take on today. Or you might say, you know what, I don't think yesterday's last assignment is going to hinder me, and when it does, maybe I'll go back then. And it's okay to start today's stuff, knowing that you skipped some of yesterday's stuff. But then please do come back to yesterday's stuff when you feel it's appropriate. Okay, that's your judgment to use. And you decide that as a pair. Any questions that are either about logistics or about the content that we just covered? Happy to spend another few minutes if we need to. No questions?
There's one from Victoria. I don't know if you addressed that.
Is there such a thing as after class? I think it's a joke, but I'm not sure.
No.
Like I said, after class.
Oh, I see.
We'll leave it there. I'll send out notes in the next half hour or so with the code. What I might do, just to do it quickly, is paste my notes from last time, which have essentially this journey. No, I think I'll create a separate gist for this, and I'll share that, because we did it slightly differently this time. Cool? Okay, enjoy. Cheers.